The shelves look different now. Walk into any provincial liquor store across Canada, and you will not find American bourbon, American wine, or American beer. They have been pulled. In Ontario, the government canceled a $100 million contract with an American satellite company. In Nova Scotia, the tolls on highways used by American commercial trucks have been doubled. And in Washington, a sitting U.S. president has repeatedly suggested, seriously, not rhetorically, that the United States should absorb its northern neighbor as a 51st state. The world's longest undefended border, the foundation of the most integrated trading relationship on the planet, is under a strain unlike anything seen in living memory. How did it come to this? And more urgently, where does it go from here? To understand the depth of what is happening, you have to start with a number. In 2023, nearly $1 trillion in goods and services crossed between the United States and Canada. Not with China, not with Germany, with Canada, the country immediately to the north, connected by shared language, shared culture, and 70 years of deliberate economic integration, is America's single largest trading partner. Canada buys more from American businesses than the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined. This is not a peripheral relationship. It is the core of North American economic life. Before we go deeper into what has happened and what it means for consumers, workers, and businesses on both sides of the border, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These dramatic economic and geopolitical developments are reshaping the world in real time, and staying informed has never been more important as this situation continues to unfold. The opening shot in this trade war was fired on February 1st, 2025, when President Trump signed executive orders imposing a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products, citing inadequate Canadian efforts to stop fentanyl smuggling across the border. Canada's response was swift. Within days, Ottawa announced retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods. 3 weeks later, that figure had escalated to $155 billion. The message from Ottawa was unambiguous. This would not go unanswered. What followed was not a short-term pressure campaign. It became a sustained, grinding economic conflict that would reshape continental trade, inflame Canadian nationalism, and send shockwaves through industries from auto manufacturing to softwood lumber to dairy farming. The tariffs cascaded quickly into specific sectors. American steel and aluminum exports to Canada faced new levies. Canadian softwood lumber, already subject to years of dispute, was hit again. Automobiles, auto parts, kitchen cabinets, copper products, one by one, the sectors that form the backbone of cross-border supply chains became battlegrounds. Canadian provinces moved with remarkable speed. Ontario's liquor authority pulled all American alcohol from its shelves and ordering catalogs for restaurants and retailers. Nova Scotia doubled highway tolls on American commercial trucks and set aside $200 million in contingency funds for affected businesses. The Yukon allocated funds for a dedicated assistance program. Procurement policies from coast to coast were reviewed to eliminate purchases from American companies wherever possible. This was not merely a federal response, it was a country mobilizing. Meanwhile, American businesses were feeling the consequences in ways many had not anticipated. A February 2025 survey found that around 60% of Americans already believed high tariffs would cause consumer prices to rise. By the following month, consumer confidence had dropped sharply, with the number of Americans expecting inflation rising significantly. The tariffs amounted to what analysts described as the largest American tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993, averaging an additional $1,500 per U.S. household in additional costs in 2026 alone. Could the administration sustain public support for a policy that was visibly raising prices at home? That question would hang over every subsequent development. This sharp contrast between competing narratives immediately created uncertainty about the purpose and endpoint of the trade war. The White House framed the tariffs as a legitimate tool of economic sovereignty, a necessary correction to decades of what it described as unfair trade practices. Ottawa and Canadian business leaders framed them as an assault on an alliance, economically irrational, legally questionable, and geopolitically reckless. Both sides presented their position as the principled one. Neither showed immediate signs of yielding. And through it all, ordinary workers in auto plants straddling the border, lumber mill employees in British Columbia, and farmers on both sides of the Great Lakes watched the argument from a distance, wondering which side would blink first and what the cost of waiting would be. That legal question, whether the tariffs were even lawful, became the next turning point. American importers challenged the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, arguing that the law does not explicitly authorize the president to impose tariffs, and that invoking it on such short notice without any preliminary investigation went far beyond its intended scope. The case worked its way through the courts for months. Then, on February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled definitively. The president cannot use IEEPA to impose tariffs. The ruling struck down the sweeping emergency tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and other countries that had been imposed under that authority. Within minutes of the ruling, markets moved. The US dollar experienced its steepest early-year decline since the 2008 financial crisis, with the dollar index falling 4.2%, a striking outcome that sent tremors through currency markets globally and, paradoxically, strengthened both the Canadian dollar and the Mexican peso. The world watched a rare moment in which America's own Supreme Court drew a legal line around presidential trade power. The administration did not accept the ruling as a conclusion. Within hours, President Trump issued new executive orders reimposing tariffs under alternative legal authorities. A new temporary 10% global tariff was announced, structured to largely exempt goods compliant with the existing Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. But the sector-specific tariffs, steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, remained in place under separate legal foundations, untouched by the court's decision. The fight had shifted legal terrain, but it had not ended. Meanwhile, in the U.S. House of Representatives, a rare bipartisan coalition voted 219 to 211 to repeal the tariffs on Canadian goods, a direct rebuke of presidential trade policy that crossed party lines. Whether it could survive the Senate and whether the president would veto it regardless remained open questions. The political dimension of this conflict has been inseparable from the economic one. President Trump has repeatedly suggested, apparently in earnest, that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. Polling consistently shows that the idea is massively unpopular in Canada, with 85% of Canadians opposed and only 9% in favor. It is, as analysts note, one of the very few issues that unites Canadian politicians across the entire political spectrum in outright rejection. Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused Trump of deliberately using tariffs as an instrument of annexation pressure. His successor, Prime Minister Mark Carney, has taken an explicitly hardline stance, presiding over retaliatory measures and a sweeping new Buy Canadian policy designed to reduce Canadian dependence on American suppliers at every level of government procurement. Canada is not merely defending a trade position. It is, by the evidence of its actions, reconsidering the architecture of its economic relationship with its largest partner, perhaps permanently. The industries caught in the middle of this confrontation are not abstractions. They are the auto sector, where deeply integrated cross-border supply chains mean that a single vehicle may cross the Canada-US border 6 or 7 times during assembly, with tariffs applied each time it does. They are the lumber industry, where Canadian mills have been fighting American duties for decades and are now absorbing a fresh wave. They are the agricultural sector, where Canadian dairy farmers fear American market access demands embedded in the looming renegotiation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, due for review on July 1st, 2026. And they are the small businesses, the manufacturers, the distributors, the retailers, that built their models on the assumption that the border was, for practical purposes, an administrative line rather than an economic wall. That renegotiation of the CUSMA trade agreement now looms as the next major flashpoint. Talks that had been called off entirely in October 2025 after Trump abruptly canceled negotiations, ostensibly over a Canadian government television advertisement featuring a Ronald Reagan speech criticizing tariffs, have cautiously resumed. Canada's trade minister traveled to Washington in early March 2026 for the first face-to-face meeting with his American counterpart since the breakdown. Analysts describe the resumption as a positive sign, while being careful not to overstate it. The agenda ahead is daunting. American demands for greater access to Canada's protected dairy market, new rules of origin for strategic sectors, alignment of Canadian digital regulation affecting American technology platforms. Canadian priorities center on protecting market access and reducing the vulnerability that the past year has exposed so painfully. Could a comprehensive deal emerge from negotiations that have already collapsed once and are shadowed by threats to terminate the agreement entirely? Might the Supreme Court ruling ultimately constrain the administration's ability to use tariffs as leverage? Whether the economic costs accumulating on both sides of the border will ultimately force a recalibration of this confrontation, or whether the political dynamics in Washington make any meaningful retreat impossible, remains genuinely uncertain. Analysts are still assessing the full damage to automotive supply chains, to energy trade, to the investment climate that once made North America the most seamlessly integrated economic region on Earth. What this moment ultimately reveals is the fragility of arrangements that were built on trust and taken for granted for decades. The Canada-US relationship was never codified in the language of adversaries, never managed through the architecture of suspicion. It was a partnership built on proximity, shared values, and the quiet logic of mutual benefit. That logic has not disappeared. The fundamentals that made Canada America's most important economic partner, its energy, its minerals, its manufacturing capacity, its geographic inseparability, have not changed. What has changed is the willingness of one side to use those fundamentals as leverage rather than as the foundation of cooperation. The world watches two countries that built the most successful bilateral trading relationship in history, now trying to decide, under enormous pressure and in real time, whether that relationship is worth preserving, and on whose terms. The answer will be measured not in headlines, but in prices, in jobs, in the communities on both sides of a border that was once the world's best argument for what neighbors could build together. Stay tuned for more updates as this situation continues to develop. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss the critical developments shaping the world.